So today we're going to talk about Narcan in Michigan libraries. Um, and we're going to talk about the new laws and what that means, as opposed to the way that it had been before. So first, as always, I have to give you my disclaimer. Um, my job here at the Library of Michigan, and by the way, I'm Claire Membiella. I'm the library law consultant for the Library of Michigan. As most of you know, I have a master's degree in library science and a law degree. Most of my career has been spent as a law librarian, and my job is kind of to be the law librarian for all of the public libraries and all of the libraries in Michigan. So my job is to help you understand and help you get information on legal issues and legal information. But I can't give you legal advice. So this disclaimer essentially says that the purpose of this presentation today is to just kind of give you an overview of the new law and what it allows, and then some tips on what a library should consider when trying to decide whether or not to participate in dispensing or in administering Narcan. And then if you do decide, the kinds of things that you should be thinking about and possibly contacting your library attorneys about. So that's what we're going to talk about today. We're also going to give you some background on the law and some general background on Narcan in particular. So first of all, let's just briefly talk about what is Narcan. A lot of you may already know this, um, but there is still some confusion. So Narcan is what's called an opioid antagonist. What it does is it works by it binds onto an opioid receptor. So it kind of works by binding onto molecules in the brain. And then once it does that, it reverses and blocks the effects of the opioid on the brain. So essentially, it kind of stops the drug from working, from giving a high, or it reverses that high. Because it is so targeted, it doesn't affect anything else. So this means that if someone should be administered Narcan, and they were having, say, an epileptic seizure, or they had passed out for some other reason, low blood sugar or diabetes or something else, the Narcan will not harm them. So it doesn't hurt to give someone Narcan if they didn't need it. And as you know, probably all of us have heard, administering Narcan if someone did need it can save their life. Narcan can be injected or inhaled. So there's different types of Narcan. You can have a Narcan in a single syringe. You can have a prepackaged syringe. You can have a bottle of Narcan and an empty syringe that you draw the Narcan up. You can have an EpiPen kind of syringe, and that's what this, if you look on the screen, the picture of the Evzio. So Evzio is manufactured by a different company than makes Narcan. And Evzio is kind of like an auto injector. So it's kind of like an EpiPen for Narcan. Um, in the state of Michigan right now, most of the time, if you utilize the standing order that we're going to talk about in a minute to obtain Narcan without a prescription, it is almost always going to be the nasal spray that you are going to get. Most of the time in Michigan, it is not the injectable type that is handed out. Um, Now, that's not to say you probably couldn't get it if you really wanted it, but most of the time it's going to be the inhaled version that you're going to get trained on and that you're likely probably going to use. But it doesn't hurt to know the different options that are out there, and different states have different options, different standards. Some states use the injectable. Some of your first responders may use the injectable. So that's what Narcan is. Narcan is generally covered by insurance. Right now, there's lots of ways to obtain it for free, and we'll get to that a little bit later. If you do pay for it, the payments can vary. The copays can be anywhere from $7 to $75. So it's best to kind of contact your pharmacy if you want to get it individually and find out how much it costs and whether your insurance would cover it. But like I said, there are lots of nonprofits that are giving it away. So why would library need Narcan? Well, in Michigan, we have all seen the reports on television, and we've all seen, or many of us have seen, for example, the American Library uh, article in American Libraries that talked about the Philadelphia librarians that were, running out of the library and administering Narcan in a park nearby. Um, but if we stick close to Michigan and you look at the statistics, now there's lots of different uh, resources for data on Narcan and on opioid crisis. There is one from the US government called drugabuse.gov, which provides really good statistics. The CDC provides statistics, and then there's very local statistics. A lot of local health departments provide statistics very locally. The state has statistics. So these are actually state statistics that I have on the screen here. And so in 2017, there were 2,033 opioid-related overdose deaths in Michigan. Um, and at that time, Michigan was the 11th highest in opioid deaths per 100,000 residents. Now, the statistics in general kind of go up and down a little bit year to year, but they are decreasing because of Narcan, which is good. And that's different from the rate of opioid addiction. So the rate of opioid rescues or the are going up, and the rate of opioid deaths are starting to trend downward a little bit. Um, so if you look at between 2015 and 2017, now the Commonwealth Fund is another entity that produces a lot of statistics. The state health system scorecard they have showed Michigan is having a 184% jump in drug poisoning deaths between 2015 and 2017, which is really kind of when a lot of this started to come out and jump. If you look at the really recent statistics, which I'm going to show in a minute, but there aren't a lot of national statistics that are really, really recent because it takes a while for them to compile them, but there are some local ones. But it's still a problem. We still have a problem. A lot of times opioid addiction goes hand in hand with economic issues, just like a lot of other types of addiction. So you have an area where there's not a lot of prospects for jobs, where the economic prospects have dimmed, where people are feeling, depressed and kind of not very optimistic about their future, where maybe you have a population that is either not highly educated or is highly educated and can't get a job. Those are all kind of flags for possible opioid addiction. There are other kinds of flags are things like right now the prevalent group are white males between the ages of like 20 and 40 are really the high key group for opioid deaths. Another group that's up and coming are elderly people. So people over 60 are starting to also to become a group. And that's a group that Michigan has a lot of, particularly in some smaller and rural areas. So, those are some just some interesting background statistics if you're interested in maybe kind of trying to consider whether or not your area might have a need. And again, we're going to go into that a little bit more later. So let's talk about specifically why library. So the previous slide kind of really was more to why Narcan, why do we need it, and this is more specifically as to why libraries. Well, a lot of this is something you guys can probably think out for yourself. And if you do, if you read the articles and you look at the research, it kind of becomes apparent. Michigan libraries, we serve a very diverse array of patrons. And that really mirrors the opioid issue. So opioids are one of the first serious abuse problems that are really going across demographics. And that's one of the things I think that has garnered a lot of the attention that it is getting, is that it's not just stereotypical, people, homeless people or people down on their luck, or what you would think of stereotypically as quote unquote an addict. It is affecting a large cross section. So it could be anybody from a high school student, even middle school, which is sad, all the way up to grandpa. My own brother had an opioid addiction because of some pain pills that he took when he had his wisdom teeth taken out and some surgery. And that's actually a huge gateway for young people. Is, back in the day, everybody got a huge bottle of Vicodin or a similar pain pill when you came home from the oral surgeon after you had your wisdom teeth out when you were in high school. And that's kind of a gateway to opioid addiction. And that's, they're finding, young athletes, and, it's really a cross section. So there are, in libraries, if you look at a lot of the people we serve, you have retired people, you have school kids, you have, moms and with little kids, all of these, you have, young men looking for jobs. All of these people are at risk for opioid addiction. Libraries often are a community hub, particularly in rural and smaller areas where there might not be a lot of other things, and where maybe broadband is at a premium. So everybody goes to the library to use the library wireless, even sitting in the parking lot. So, that is, a prime place where you could have people overdosing. Also, libraries are very welcoming places in big cities and small towns. They offer, a welcoming place for people who might not feel welcome anywhere else. So people who are homeless, people who are down on their luck, people who, feel cast out, people who have some mental illness, maybe depression, or, libraries can be very welcoming places. Librarians are often very friendly and very welcoming and very helpful. A lot of libraries offer extra services like social services and assistance in locating, municipal services like housing and food banks. And, libraries provide all of these kinds of services now. And so, all of these people who are utilizing these services could be people who are at risk for an opioid addiction. It also, at its very basics, libraries can be a very dry, warm place to go and, use your needle. A lot of libraries are very large spaces. Shelves provide a lot of nooks and crannies where people can hide. Public bathrooms provide a very, a place to do this. So in a lot of ways, libraries are a place that could be looked at as an opportunity, I guess, for lack of a better word. So does this really happen? So we all heard the stories, and so does this really happen in Michigan, where people in the libraries have needed overdoses or reversal of overdoses? And the answer is yes. There are lots of anecdotal stories. Grand Rapids, Flint, Detroit. The director at East Lansing has a very compelling story, and Upper Peninsula. Upper Peninsula in Michigan is one of the hard hit areas in the state for opioid addiction. Now, in addition to public libraries, academic libraries also experience issues. Again, if you look at that demographic of young white men from age 20 to 40, 20, 21, 22, maybe even up to 25 are a lot of times college kids. And again, this is the model opioid user does often not skew with demographics. You can't say it's always a wealthy person or it's always a poor person, or it can be, your middle class kid who's at MSU. So a lot of academic libraries and college campuses are also looking at this issue. Now, Narcan administration statistics are kept by some county health departments in Michigan, actually a lot more than you might think. And you can easily find it by Googling. That's how I found Ingham counties. Now, Ingham County, if you look at Ingham County, which is, obviously not, Ingham County is not one of the counties in Michigan that has the biggest impact. You can see on the slide here that the first responders in Ingham County administered naloxone 255 times in 2016, 373 in 2017, and 302 in the first 11 months of 2018. So you can see how that is rising. So the administration of Narcan is going up, which is actually a pretty good thing. Now, in Michigan, in 2014 and amended in 2016, Michigan did pass a couple laws dealing with the administration of Narcan. They also followed a lot of other states in utilizing what's called a standing order. Now, a standing order, normally, if you think of Narcan, Narcan is a prescription drug. So most of the time, you can't get a prescription drug without a prescription, right? Which means going to your doctor and asking for it and getting a prescription. Well, in order to make naloxone more available, states started to utilize this tool called a standing order. A standing order means that the chief medical officer of the state, and yes, Michigan does have a chief medical officer, it's kind of like the surgeon general for the state, drafted a letter, so it's kind of an administrative decision, that permitted the dispensing of Narcan from a pharmacy without an individual prescription. So in other words, you can look at it as a blanket prescription. And what it really did is this letter is directed towards pharmacists. So it's giving pharmacists permission to then dispense the drug to certain entities under certain circumstances. And it's pretty broad. It's a pretty broad law. Now, however, the problem with the law that was in 2016 or 14 and then amended in 2016 is that when you read through in the Public Health Code and you read through the law, one of the first things when you're reading a statute that's helpful to do is to always look at the definitions. So when you see words like individual or person, it's always a good idea to go back and see, well, how do they define what's a person? What's an individual? What's a government entity? What's a political subdivision? So whenever you're reading a statute that gives you a specific term, a lot of times it's helpful to go back and review the definitions within that statute. And every piece of legislation that comes out should have definitions that the legislature uses to inform you and inform attorneys and inform other people reading the law of what specifically they intend. So what does this phrase mean? And that helps you figure out and interpret the law. So when you look at the law from 2014 amended in 2016, it says a person that administers an opioid antagonist to an individual who he or she believes is suffering an opioid-related overdose and that acts in good faith and with reasonable care is immune from criminal prosecution or sanction. And then there's another, so that's criminal prosecution, and then there's another law that's under a different section of the Michigan compiled laws that gives you the civil liability exemption. So two separate laws together gives somebody who's giving a Narcan inhaler to someone they believe is having an overdose, gives them that release from liability. It's kind of like a Good Samaritan law for the opioid inhibitor. But when you look up in the Public Health Code, which is this first one here, it says that a person is an individual, a partnership, a corporation, an association, a private corporation, a personal representative, a receiver, trustee, assignee, or other legal entity, but it specifically excludes a governmental entity unless specifically provided. So this law specifically, those two opioid specifically do not pertain or did not pertain to government entities, which is a problem for libraries because we're government entities. So that's kind of how this new legislation started, is once we became aware of that and we worked with MLA, and we said, hey, this is a big problem, then MLA worked their magic and lobbied and worked to get a bill done that would open up that would specifically give libraries the exemption from liability. Now, schools and first responders already had that because their associations had already passed separate individual laws. An individual law in the school code that gave schools exemption, and then individual laws in the area of the code that deals with emergency medicine and law enforcement that gave them the release from liability. but nowhere was there anything for libraries. So what happened is the new laws, originally we had just one, which would have given pharmacists the permission to dispense to libraries, and then libraries permission to administer, to hold and administer without fear of criminal or civil liability. However, once this went through the legislature, when MLA was shepherding it through the legislature, a lot of the legislators, the senators and the representatives who looked at this, would ask questions about, well, why do you need this? And why isn't this in it already? And what about other government entities? And so it was kind of decided that let's amend this law and not make it just for libraries, but make it for every government entity. And therefore, we'll take away the laws written specifically for schools and first responders, and we'll bundle them into this new law too. So that now every government entity has civil and criminal exemptions from liability for the administration of naloxone or Narcan to someone they believe in good faith is having an opioid overdose. And that's what these two laws do. These two laws, one of them is the law that gives pharmacists the permission and the release from liability for dispensing it under that standing order. And the other one gives libraries and other government entities the ability to administer it without fear of liability. So specifically, what these laws permit public entities. Now, again, remember I mentioned definitions. If you look through the statute and you look at the definitions, there's various definitions. They use everything from state to government entity to political subdivision. And essentially what it all amounts to, if you read through it, is that any state agency, any municipality, any political subdivision, and they specifically list out libraries, but that would mean like village and city and all of them, and any public college and university, so that would cover public college academic libraries, can get Narcan and can not only purchase it, because before an individual could purchase Narcan, so any of your staff could individually purchase Narcan and bring it to work. But if in the context of bringing it, like let's say if a director purchased Narcan and put it in their desk and said to their employees, look, I have Narcan, if you see anybody that needs it, that could bring the library into a liability circumstance. Well, what this does is permit the library to purchase the Narcan as an entity. So that means the prescription label would say Capillary District Library or Traverse Area District Library, or it would list out the actual name of the library. And then libraries could have more than one dose of it and store them and make them available to staff under certain conditions. And we're going to get to that in a minute. So they can purchase, hold it, and then they can distribute it to employees who have been trained to administer it. So one of the criteria in order to retain that exemption from liability is because, in legislation, you receive something, but you kind of usually have to give something too. So usually there's criteria or rules that you have to follow. So in order to take advantage of this and have a library purchase and possess Narcan, employees who are going to administer it have to be trained. Now, there's not a lot in the law that specifies exactly what that training should look like, but we're going to move on to that in just a second, but they do have to have training on how to administer it. And in order to use it without fear of liability, the employee has to have reason to believe the individual is experiencing an opioid-related overdose. So this kind of goes along with the training, because training will show you what does an opioid overdose look like. What does a person typically look like who is having an opioid overdose as opposed to a heart attack or a diabetic incident? You know, it'll tell you specific signs to look for when you see somebody who looks like they might be in peril. And that can help inform you as to whether or not it might be opioid. But as long as you are doing it in good faith, which means you are really following your training, and you know it's really reasonable that this person might be suffering an opioid overdose, and that the library staff member has good intentions, then you are complying within the law for the liability exemption. So training and good faith. So let's talk about who is included. So when you talk about, when a library gets it, who can they train? Well, employees, contractual staff, and employees could be part-time employees or full-time employees, could be contractual staff. So for example, if you have a contract for a cleaning service, or you have a contract for security, either one of those entities could also be included. And in fact, there are some libraries that have opted to just have their security services handle this. And if you do contract with a security service, chances are that security service is already training their people in Narcan and may already offer that as an option that you can have for as part of your security package. Because the existing law, remember, covers all corporations, all organizations, all entities. So for example, your friends group were already covered for the liability because they're an organization and they're a corporation. They're not a government entity. So it can get very confusing. Your board members are covered, your volunteers are covered. So is this mandatory? So is Narcan, because we have this Narcan law, is it required? No. This is purely voluntary. The law is designed to provide a tool that a library can use. A library does not have to adopt a Narcan program or policy. Like any other program or any other policy, it is up to the library to look at their community and determine what is the best course for their community and their library. So it is not mandatory. Now, your individual staff can still obtain Narcan on their own, and if you do decide to do that, for example, have your policy be that your staff, that the library is not going to do anything, but that your staff may do it on their own, then you may want to talk to your library attorney about the best way to kind of implement that. So you may just, because there may be some other types of legal issues that could arise. I would just recommend that you talk to your attorney if that's how you want to do it. Should you have, what would be the ramification if you had a list of all the staff that had Narcan on their own? Do you need to do that? Should you not do that? So those are kind of the questions if you are going to just leave it up to your staff to do on your own and not have one. If you do decide to adopt a program or a policy, is it an all or nothing? No, it is not. Just like any other policy, the library can decide how they want to do this. And you can make it purely volunteer. You can have say, we want to do this, we want to support this. Do we have any volunteers who'd be willing to go through the training and do this? And in fact, it's probably not a good idea to force someone to do it who doesn't want to do it. That's probably just not a good idea. As with other policies, again, your decision is your own. Now, when you're considering whether or not to do this, a lot of the literature that I've read and a lot of the videos I've seen on this issue all suggest, and this seems like a really good idea to me, that if you're on the fence about this, one of the things you should do is contact your first responders and your local law enforcement and ask them first. Try to determine if there is a problem in your community with with opioids. Now, just because you don't have a quote unquote real problem doesn't mean it can't happen. But, there are some communities that are very, very hard hit. And so, if you're trying to figure out if your community is one of those communities, one of the things you could do, and whether having the library have it would really help, one of the things you could do, again, you're looking at like risk versus benefit. So just like you do with almost any decision you make, the work we have to put into it and the things we have to do versus what is the benefit to the community and the benefit to the library. So first you can contact your first responders and local law enforcement and ask them how many times have they administered Narcan last year and this year. And that can kind of give you a good idea. If they've only administered it a few times, then that could be indicative that maybe your area does not have a serious problem. And if you have police and first responders that do carry it, then that could also inform your decision. So you can talk to them and say, look, we're thinking of doing it. What do you think? Do you think this is a community need? Here's what we're thinking about. The other thing you can do is, and at the bottom here, I have some statistics for Ingham County. Remember, I mentioned that the health departments of the different counties do provide some information on how opioids and Narcan is being used in that area by first responders. So this is the first few months of 2019 for Ingham County. And the chart shows you all of 2018 and the first few months of 2019. And then this map is kind of a heat map that shows the really danger areas, the high areas of use. So you can see the yellow areas here are the areas of very high use, and the blue areas are the areas of use but lesser use. So you can kind of look and see where your library is and whether or not you're in one of those pockets, which would probably make it more likely that you might want to consider it if you're kind of bent that way. Also, the next thing to do is to contact your local first responders, your ambulance, your rescue, your paramedics, your fire department, and ask what the average response time is to get to your library. In Michigan, almost every first responder, paramedic, and police officer carries it. Not absolutely all of them. So again, that's why you would want to contact your first responders when you're considering that, but many, many do. So if you say, okay, what would it take if we had someone in the library who looked like they were experiencing an opioid overdose? How long would it take for you to get here? And depending on what they tell you, so it might be, that again can help inform your decision as to whether, in looking at that analysis, whether or not the library should do this or wants to do this. Ask them, what about different times of day? The library is open late at night. It's heavily used. We're open during the mornings. We're open on the weekends. You may find that maybe the weekends they're shorter staffed and the response time is longer. So maybe you think, okay, you know what, maybe it is going to be good for us to have it. So there's a lot of considerations, to kind of look at when you're determining this, if you're not sure, if you don't automatically know, well, we definitely want to do it or we definitely don't. These are some things that you can look at when you're trying to form your opinion. You want to look at your municipal laws and policies like you should for just about any kind of policy you're considering. And make sure that your local municipality isn't requiring that government entities hold Narcan. And you might also, depending on your establishment type, okay, if your library is considered a department of your city, then you're going to want to talk to your city and find out what your city's policy is for the government departments as far as Narcan goes, because that's another consideration. If you're an academic library, you should contact your campus police or your campus, your dean of your school, because it could depend. It could depend. Some academic libraries institute this type of thing as part of their public safety, and so if the public safety officers have it, I've worked in academic libraries most of my career, and I know of academic libraries where public safety might prevent library employees from doing it on a institutional basis, which again, individuals could still have it. But as far as the library having it in their name, it could be that maybe the Narcan you get is going to be in the university's name because it's already public safety or your emergency management department, depending on, you know, whatever it's called. They may have a system set up or a program set up where they give you the Narcan and they provide the training. So again, those of you that are a part of a bigger entity and you're not completely a standalone library are going to have some additional things that you have to consider. So, you know, you can't always consider this in just the bubble of the library. The other thing to look at when you're considering this is sustainability. Okay, so that means that, you know, there is a training requirement in the law. And that means that, you know, your training, if you do a big training when you're starting this and then you don't do it again, well, that could be problematic because as you get new employees, if they want to do it, you have to make sure they get trained. You're going to want to make sure, just from a basic practical matter, that your employees are all trained in a consistent way, that they all are kind of consistent procedures. You're going to want to make sure that they get updated. You know, if anything new happens, if any, you know, say newer version of the drug comes out that requires something a little different, or if the signs of an overdose mutate because of a new version of an opioid that comes out. You know, there could be different things that happen that you're going to want to make sure that you're on top of, just like you would, you know, CPR training requires updates. And a continuation. So if one director leaves and a new director comes in, it's one of the things that, you know, you have to look at, well, this policy, this procedure, and how is it going to continue? The management of the drug itself. How are you going to store it? How are you going to restock it if it gets used? Whose responsibility is it going to be to order the next one? How are you going to maintain it? Which means, you know, maybe luckily you may, you know, do all of this and maybe you'll have a whole year where you never have to administer it. Well, then someone has to be on top of replacing an expired bottle of Narcan. So someone has to be on top of wherever you keep it, whether it's in your first aid kit, which is probably a really good idea, is how, you know, keep an eye on it. And if it does expire, who's in charge of making sure they get the next one? Who's in charge of the kit of materials that should go with it? Because when you do get trained, you'll learn that this isn't just a squirt of Narcan up someone's nose. It's kind of a whole process. So someone who's experiencing an opioid addiction, the nature of the medicine is that it's literally taking away their high. So when they revive, very often their first response is anger, that you basically stole their high and you wasted their money. So they're very angry and they can get very agitated. They can also get physically ill. They can go into cardiac arrest. So it's not guaranteed all those things will happen, but those are all things that can and very frequently do happen. So if you have someone who wants to do Narcan, it might be also smart to have them CPR certified and know how to administer CPR. You're going to want to have like a kit of some biohazard materials, which, you know, public libraries, you all probably do have that anyway, because we all know that there are bodily fluids in libraries. But things like gloves, things like, you know, maybe a bag to put if you find any drug paraphernalia. So if there's a needle or a spoon or whatever, a bottle of pills, whatever, that, you know, you want to put that in a bag, or you may want to leave it and have someone right there for when the police come to deal with that. I mean, that's a possibility too. But, you know, those are some things that you're going to want to consider that you need to have on hand. And again, if those gets used, someone's going to have to be in charge of making sure they get replenished. Now, there are some additional information that can help you in your considerations. There's a really good WebJunction kind of section, article, class that gives a whole list of really good articles, including those ALA articles I mentioned. Also, there's a lot of newspaper. If you just, again, Google opioid overdoses, Michigan, and there's a lot of newspaper articles that come up that are also pretty informative. Okay, so now you've decided that you are going to do it or you're not going to do it. You've made your decision. Now what? Well, you want to make sure if you are going to do it, you want to make sure that you have a policy. Now, let's talk a little bit about the difference between a policy and a procedure. So, a policy is broader. So, it's generally kind of a something that says, okay, this library, you know, you can go into some legal background. That statute gives the library this ability and this authority, and this library has decided to take advantage of this. And then in your policy, you might want to say, are you requiring it? So are you, you know, is it volunteer that you are going to do it, and that the way that it's determined who's going to administer it is it's by volunteer, staff who volunteer. If you're going to require your security personnel to do it, then you would put that in the policy. This library is going to rely on its security personnel. And then you would put in your procedures how that works. So the procedures are really your step-by-step how you implement a policy. So your policy can be fairly brief. This is what we're doing. This is why we're doing it. And this is the authority that gives us the right to do it. And the reason why you might want to have both is because if you have, and again, this is purely hypothetical, but let's say you have an employee, your library decides to administer Narcan. You put in your policy that is purely on a volunteer basis, but you have an employee who has a grievance because they feel pressured to do it. They feel it could be a cultural pressure in terms of other employees making them feel like they need to do it, or it could just be their own mind. But if you have a policy that says we specifically have it on a volunteer basis, then that can protect you, the library, if an employee complains, because it lays it very clear. The library's policy is this. We do not require every employee to do it. So again, policies are useful as a foundation to point to when there could be possible conflict. It's not, you don't have to have a policy on Narcan, but it's probably not a bad idea. If it's something that you're instituting as something the library is going to do and commit itself to, it might not hurt to have, a couple lines in your policy manual, maybe within your emergency policies or your first aid policies, or in those areas. Do you need to put it in someone's job description? Probably not, unless you have a job that maybe is a disaster person and you're going to require that position to be a Narcan rescuer. If you're going to require a particular position to do it, then I would put it in the job description. If you're not, then I probably wouldn't. If you're making it totally volunteer, I wouldn't worry about it. So everybody has to get trained, and that is something else you can put in the policy. If you're going to do it, they have to get trained. But if you want to enforce a particular type of training, you could put that in your policy, or you could put it in your procedure. Are you going to promote or notice that you're doing it? There's some very big pros and cons to that. That is something else that you could maybe put in your policy. I would recommend that in your policy, you can keep it as streamlined as you want, but anything that you're definitely going to require, you may, again, policies don't get frequently updated, and it may be more difficult to update them. So you don't want to put a whole lot in the policy. The policy really should be, this is what we're doing and this is why. And then your procedures are the nitpicky A, B, and C stuff. So for example, the procedures would be, where are you going to get your Narcan? Are you going to stick it in the first aid kit? Where is it going to be stored? Are you going to consider it, are the procedures going to be part of your first aid procedures or your emergency procedures? Or are you going to put it public services procedures? What are your maintenance responsibilities? Are you going to have, if you're going to have staff volunteer, are you going to have, a certain number of volunteers? So are you going to say anybody, or are you going to say, well, we're going to start with 10 or 5? And, obviously we might want somebody who works at night, somebody who works during the day. That's kind of really up to you. Or you can just leave it open and say, let's see who wants to do it. You want to make sure that you have who is going to be responsible for maintaining it in your procedures. And then what happens with the used Narcan? How do you dispose of it? Now remember, it's a drug, so it's not something that you probably just want to throw in the garbage can. So you're probably going to want to have somebody, return it with, how you can go to your pharmacy and drop it in the over-the-counter drug bin or in the prescription drug bin. So, that's something that you have to figure out, and you can talk to your local pharmacy about the best place to dispose of it. And then indicate whether or not whether your library does incident reports for problems or for security issues or for first aid issues or injuries. And then you want to make sure your staff who are going to administer this keep up with that they do incident reports and reporting. If you are a department of a municipality, does your municipality require this kind of reporting? What are their procedures? And your procedures are going to need to align with theirs. So, it's kind of some obvious stuff, but those are just some additional things to kind of think of. Now, sample policies. More and more states are coming out with web pages on this and toolkits for libraries considering this. New York State has some really good ones, and this is an example of just the beginning part of New York State's policy. And as you can see, it's a little lengthy, but it really just kind of gives the background, and it gives the legal authority that libraries have to do it. So that's, if you're considering doing a policy, here's something that you can kind of take a look at. I am also right now working on a toolkit for Michigan that is almost finished, and hopefully that'll be finished by the end of the month, and we will be posting that, which will have some ideas for sample policies for Michigan here. You can see that this New York policy is very obviously rooted in New York law. We'll have some sample ones for Michigan, as well as things like where you can get Narcan from, list of nonprofits for training. So we'll have all of that. There is a couple of those that I did put in here. For example, if you are considering training, there are a lot of options. You can do individual training. There's lots of videos. There's lots of nonprofits that offer training on site where, people can go to training and take advantage of it, members of the public. Or you can invite someone in to an in-service or one of your staff trainings, or you could create a staff training just for this. And excellent option is your local public health department. So Ingham County, Clinton, Macomb County, Wayne County, Jackson County, most of the counties in Michigan, their public health departments do offer training, and they will come to your site, with, a lot of them will bring a dummy with them with a sample of the Narcan and show you exactly how to do it and tell you exactly what you need to be prepared for. So that's very helpful. Grand Rapids has a redproject.org. That's another nonprofit. It's not part of the county government or the state government that offers training. They do a lot of online training, a lot of materials on their website. The Red Cross does a kind of a distance ed training online. It costs $25 per person, but at the end you get kind of a certificate, just like they give you a certificate when you're CPR certified. They'll give you a certificate that you're Narcan certified. So sometimes that, that will appeal to some people. But there's a ton of options for training, and a lot of the training is free. A lot of nonprofits will come train you for free. So it's definitely, worth bringing someone in. I've looked at a lot of videos on training. They're not bad. They give you a good introduction. But I think, like CPR training, for anyone who's ever done CPR training, it's very different to watch it than it is when they give you an opportunity to actually practice on a mannequin. So, you know, it is kind of nice to have a training where you have the opportunity to actually ask questions and, you know, to kind of tailor the training to your individual situation. So that's why I highly recommend bringing someone in to train. And since there are so many options and it's so cost effective and it's not expensive, that I would highly recommend that. For some of you, your police departments may do it. So your first responders or your police department may also offer it. So that's another question that you can ask them too. So if you decide not to hold Narcan, now again, this is like many other policies. This is actually can be very charged. You know, there's people who feel very strongly about this in both directions. Um, just like any other policy, it's really up to the individual library and their board and their director as to whether this is, you know, something that they want to do for their community, whether it's something they're able to do for their community, depending on your staffing and many other things. And that if you can't, there are other options to make sure that your public are covered. Okay, there are things like if you have a security guard, if you contract with security, like I said, a lot of them already do it. Your local responders, communicate with your local responders, see how fast they can get there. So there are things, you know, that you can do to help if you don't want to actually hold Narcan. Again, you want to make sure that your emergency procedures reflect whatever it is you decide to do. And you may also want to put it in a policy if you decide not to do it. You may want to indicate why for anyone else who comes. You may want to also indicate if, you know, you're in, again, under the law, even if the library says they don't want to do it, individual staff can still have it. But as I said before, you want to confer with your attorney on this in order to make sure that even if individual staff have it, the library's liability is still preserved. Okay, because it can get kind of sticky if you have staff who are doing it on their own and doing it in the library during work hours. So it's not that they can't do it. It's just like anything else. You want to go in prepared and you want to go in knowledgeable about what are the things you need to be on the lookout for and the things that you need to make sure are put in policies or that everybody understands. It's just, you know, because this is so new, that's why I say you would want to talk to your attorney. And then maybe if you don't want to have Narcan, maybe you hold a public training. Maybe you bring in, like you bring in a program and a lot of other things. Maybe you bring in a nonprofit to do a public Narcan training. And a lot of these nonprofits do it all the time for members of the public. They hold public trainings all the time. So maybe you make the library available for a public training and you know, put it out there, you promote it. And then members of the public can get in and get their own Narcan and learn how to do it. And then that increases in your community the number of people that have it. So even if the library decides not to do it on any given day, maybe some of your patrons will have it on them. So, you know, there are, as I said, other things you can do to help out and to mitigate if the library decides as an institution this is not something they feel they can do. Make sure that you have information awareness out there. You could have, you know, reference staff could do guides on, you know, how to obtain Narcan. How do you get, you know, where do you get it from? Where can you get training? What does opioid addiction look like? How can someone who feels that someone they love or themselves may have an opioid addiction, how can they get help? So maybe, you know, you have a bulletin board or you have a public information area where you put that there. That's another way to help and mitigate it. So there's, again, different ways the library can still help and still participate without actually doing it. So again, I mentioned we are working on a Narcan toolkit with background information on, you know, some of what I just told you, what the legal requirements are, some resources, and then some sample policies and procedures. So that is pretty much all of the information that I had. If you have any questions, it is 11:24. So if anybody has a question, I see there's one. What could happen if your library decides to administer Narcan, then the drug is not administered and the person dies or the person survives, but find out the library had it in possession and didn't use it? That's a very good question, and actually something I just researched in preparation for this webinar. Right now, They're in the Good Samaritan laws, and a lot of the law on this is not yet Narcan. It is things like the automatic defibrillator machines or the CPR. And right now in Michigan, you are not going to be in trouble if you had Narcan and you didn't use it. This is it is there's not a law in Michigan that says that if you are a bystander and you have the ability to help, you have to help. So you should be okay, but again, some of that is also in good faith, that maybe some of it could speak to the reason why you're not helping. But generally, if you're not helping, everything that I could find on this right now would indicate that you should not be in trouble for that. Because mistakes happen, things happen. There could be confusion of who's there, who isn't there. If there's Narcan there and the person who knows how to use it isn't there, or there could be all different issues going on. And that's something too that I will be putting in the toolkit is, full legal information with all of that. But all of the legal authority I can find now that deals with things like defibrillators is that there isn't, really isn't right now a strong law that would say you're going to get in trouble. Yeah. And that's human nature. Again, that's staff freezing and there being because the worry is that if something happens, people are going to be nervous and staff's going to freeze. As long as, part of the law around this centers upon your duty to the individual and your relationship with the individual that is suffering. So library has some duties with regard to its patrons, but say, for example, a school and its students has stronger ties. If you're a school teacher and you have students in your class every day, that creates kind of a stronger bond. I would say as long as you call 911, and the intent isn't that you were willfully withholding it, like, oh my gosh, we don't want to help that person because they're horrible, or as long as there's not malice or willful intent to withhold it. If it's a situation where someone just freezes, the law is not usually going to hold you responsible for that. Again, as long as if someone calls 911 and does shows good faith that they were trying to help this person, but they wanted to help this person, but for whatever reason just were unable to. And so freezing could be an unable to. So those are, again, some of it is intent, and what the general expectations are of a patron who's going into the library. So yeah, I think as long as you call 911 and you probably would be okay. Anybody else have any questions? Oh, okay. Then we are completed. I will be this afternoon sending out to all of you the slides along with the link to the recording, and keep an eye out when we're completed with the toolkit. I'll be sending that out as well. And I thank you very much for your attention, and I hope to talk to you soon. Thanks. Y'all have a great weekend. Bye.